"They're uncontrollable," he said. "And they're insanely strong. Look at that poor nurse over there. They've scratched her cheek so badly she'll be lucky not to have permanent scars." "When did this start?" asked Jamila. "About an hour ago. First of all, they began to get restless and noisy and uncooperative. Then they started shouting and screaming and knocking over the glasses of water on their bedside tables. After that, they gradually grew more and more aggressive." "That's so strange. When we first carried them out of the sewer, they seemed to be thankful. They weren't aggressive at all." Even as Jamila spoke, 3 or 4 of the children were kicking at the doors. They kicked them again and again, until the veneer around the lock split apart. "Can't you sedate them?" asked Jerry. "Give them a dose of the old Rohypnol or something like that?" "I've already tried to tranquilize 2 of the most violent. I gave them 4 milligram doses of lorazepam, which usually works very quickly, but it had absolutely no effect at all. Some of them are so severely malformed that I wouldn't know where to start injecting them, or if they had a stomach to digest a tablet, if they allowed me to feed it to them." "Do you have any idea why they're behaving like this?" Dr. Latimer shook his head. "It's like some form of mass hysteria. I've called Dr. Feldman. He's the head of our psychiatric team, and he should be here at any moment. But I personally think it's connected to their physical malformation. They're feeling deeply frustrated because they're so seriously disabled, and I'm sure some of them are suffering chronic pain too." He paused and beckoned them over to the opposite side of the corridor, so that none of the nurses or police officers could hear what he had to say next. "I think they're all fully aware, too, how limited their lifespan is going to be. At least 5 of them wanted to know how long they can expect to live. 'When am I going to die?' they asked me. They said that their mother would never tell them. By their mother, I presume they mean a woman who adopted them all." "Yes, well, sort of," said Jamila. "They have every reason to be worried, though," said Dr. Latimer. "I doubt if even the least malformed of them will survive for more than a month, at the outside. The worst, I expect to go within a week or so. No human beings can exist for long if they have no stomach or intestines, or their heart is so misshapen it can barely manage to pump blood around their bodies. Some of them are suffering from mesocardia, too." "Sorry to be ignorant, but what's that?" asked Jerry. "For the first 6 weeks of their development, the internal organs of all embryos are symmetrical. After that, the heart makes its way to the left, and the liver rotates into place on the right. It makes for a more efficient body if the organs are arranged as compactly as possible. But sometimes the heart remains in the center of the body, and this is a serious condition that affects circulation. At least 3 of these children have this condition. They are like embryos that have grown in size, but never developed in the way that they should." "So what's your verdict? I mean, medically speaking." "To be absolutely frank with you, I believe the kindest option would be to euthanize them. I have suggested it in cases of bacterial association that are far less debilitating than these. They have no meaningful future. They face nothing but pain and frustration and an early death. If an ultrasound scan had shown me children in this condition while they were still in utero, I would immediately have recommended that they be aborted." "We believe they were," Jamila told him. I'm sorry? They were aborted? Then how did they survive and grow to such a size? That's impossible." "We're not entirely sure ourselves how they survived," said Jerry. "But we think that this mother you referred to has some way of keeping a fetus alive and kicking, even if it's been given the old heave-ho." "I've never heard of such a thing. I simply can't understand how it could be done." "It may be done by transplanting the aborted fetus into the womb of another woman," said Jamila. "We have come across several cases recently where this appears to have happened, like hatching cuckoos in another bird's nest." Dr. Latimer shook his head again. I keep up to date with every advancement in paediatrics, and I've seen no mention of any procedure like that. Not even with a healthy fetus, let alone a fetus so malformed that it can barely breathe or digest any nutrition. I mean, why would anyone do that? I don't know what else to say to you at this stage, Dr. Latimer. We are making some progress with this investigation, but only slowly, and there is a long way to go. They waited outside Peaceful Ward for another hour. Gradually, the screaming and the kicking and the chair-throwing petered out. And eventually, when they looked in through the windows, they could see that all the children had fallen asleep. Some of them were lying on the floor. Others had dropped on top of heaps of blankets. The whole ward was wrecked with broken glass and tipped-over bedside cupboards and ripped-open pillows strewn everywhere. But when they unlocked the doors and opened them, it was silent inside, except for thin, constricted breathing. Andrew Tanner came up and said, "What's the next move, then? They may be asleep now, but they're not going to stay asleep forever, are they?" "I'm going to try dosing them all with propofol," said Dr. Latimer. "That's what we usually use here to induce a coma. I still have several further tests I want to carry out, and it'll be much easier to do that if they're all unconscious. Then we can sit down and discuss what the way forward is going to be, both medically and legally, and, I suppose, morally, too." "I've examined all of them now," said Andrew Tanner. "It's extraordinary, because 3 or 4 of them have limbs that have been transplanted from other people. Some of them quite unsuitable, such as adult arms on a young child's torso. And what's even more extraordinary is that they've taken and grown. I can't think how that's been done, or how the limbs could possibly not have been rejected." "What about the children as a whole, though?" asked Jamila. "Do you think it's possible to save them?" "It depends what you mean by saving them. Myself, I think that it would be futile to attempt to give them arms and legs, even prosthetics. Almost all of them are beyond physical reconstruction, and that's not even counting the ones who are missing parts of their brains. All we would be doing is putting them through extreme and unnecessary suffering. From my point of view, the answer is palliative care until they naturally pass away." They were still talking when a uniformed police constable came along the corridor with a beige-haired Belgian Malinois. He told the dog to sit, and it obeyed instantly, its tongue hanging out. Jamila said, "Thank you for coming so promptly. We have a very unusual situation here." "Maitland's the name," said the dog handler. He had dark circles around his eyes, like his dog. "There's 2 armed PCs downstairs, so I'm wondering what you need me and Blizzard for." "Inside that ward we have a number of sick children, 22 in all. They are sleeping at the moment, although when they wake up they can be highly aggressive. But it's not the children who are really the problem. Dr. Latimer here is going to try and sedate them so that they stay reasonably calm. The problem is that they have what you might call a guardian, or a foster parent, for want of a better description." "I take it this foster parent's being a bit of a nuisance, then? Male or female?" "Female, but no ordinary woman, I warn you. She has the ability to get past security, although we are not certain how she does it. She is always dressed in a cloak and a hood, so that she looks like somebody wearing fancy dress for Halloween. However, this is not fancy dress. She is extremely dangerous, and if she appears here, you need to treat her with the greatest caution." PC Maitland narrowed his eyes, and it was clear that he was having difficulty in believing any of this. "A woman, in a cloak and a hood, and she can get past 2 armed PCs without them seeing her?" "We believe so, yes. But we also believe that there is one way of chasing her away. We're not 100% certain, but we think that she has a fear of dogs. She needs to be afraid of Blizzard here, I'll tell you. He's the most obedient dog I've ever had the pleasure to train, so long as you keep him active all day and throw him his ball every 5 minutes. On the other hand, if you was a tea leaf making a run for it, and I told him to go for the KILL, you wouldn't stand a chance in hell. He's like Jaws with legs. Jerry lifted his hand to pat Blizzard on the head, but Blizzard looked up at him and snarled, in the same way that Tough Nut snarled at him. No, best not, said PC Maitland. Surprising how many people make that mistake, patting a dog on the head. If you do that, dogs always think that you're going to hit them, or that you're telling them off. Blizzard here, he'd bite your fingers off right to the knuckles, and once he'd chewed them, he wouldn't spit them out either. Good boy, Blizzard, said Jerry, raising one hand in a high five. Respect. Jamila and Jerry had a last few words with the paediatricians and the nurses, and the police officers who would be staying on duty here at the hospital. Dr. Latimer had already started to put each of the children into a medically induced coma, and he told them that so far the propofol seemed to be taking effect, and that none of the comatose children had stirred. Bloody hell, I'm cream-crackered, said Jerry, as they went down in the lift. Jamila was looking at herself in the mirror at the back of the lift. I used to think that I would love to have children, she said. Now I'm not so sure. What, not even my kids? Said Jerry, and immediately wished that he hadn't. Jamila didn't answer that, and walked out of the lift ahead of him. She didn't speak again until they were back at Peckham Police Station. Chapter 34. Louise was woken at 2:10 a.m. by a churning sensation inside her womb, as if the blades of a kitchen blender were slowly turning over. She reached over to switch on her bedside lamp and then sat up. When she pulled up her nightgown, she could actually see her stomach lumping up. She gagged, and her mouth filled with bile, although she couldn't vomit. Since Dr. Gupta had shown her the scans of the 2 fetuses that were growing inside her, she hadn't been able to eat. She felt desperate, but she had nobody to confide in. Her sister Suzanne hadn't spoken to her for more than 5 years. Her mother would only react with disgust that she was pregnant, even if she protested that she hadn't slept with anybody. 2 or 3 of the elderly residents of the Whittington were kind and sympathetic, and treated her like a granddaughter, but they were suffering from varying degrees of dementia or memory loss, and they wouldn't have understood what she meant if she told them that she was expecting 2 distorted babies. There had been several times in her life when she had wondered if she would be better off committing suicide. When she was 13, she'd been so badly bullied at school, she had taken to cutting her arms with a broken test tube from the science lab. When Alan had left her, she'd even gone to the hardware shop and bought a washing line to hang herself. Each time, though, she had sat on her bed and decided that tomorrow might be better. Tomorrow, she might have lost at least another 2 pounds. The day after tomorrow, when she had lost even more weight, she might meet another man. His name would be Roger, and he would have dark hair and an infectious grin. So far, she had lost no weight, and met no men called Roger, and now her womb had been invaded by these 2 hideous fetuses. Not only her womb, but her nervous system and her whole personality. If it would kill her to get rid of them, she might as well die anyway. She had the key to the rest home pharmacy cupboard, where there was enough quetiapine to treat 11 residents with Alzheimer's, and that would certainly be enough to stop her heart. Her womb contracted with another agonizing pang, and she felt an abrasive sensation all the way up her back, as if her spinal cord had been rubbed with glass paper. She bent forward, her eyes squeezed tight shut until the spasm had passed. Then she thought, "That's it. I can't bear this. I just want it to be over. Dying can't be any worse than going to sleep. The only difference is you don't wake up. And why should I want to wake up with these monsters inside me? She opened her eyes and sat up. Suddenly she felt peaceful. All her life she had done what other people had told her to do, and tried to please them even when they had mocked her and criticised her. Now these hideous, scratchy fetuses were trying to take possession not only of her body, but her soul as well. Enough was enough. From this moment, only one person was going to control her destiny, and that was her. She stood up, but as she stood up, she became aware of that smoky smell again. Surely the groundsman hadn't lit another bonfire. Not now, in the middle of the night. Her window was shut, so how had it penetrated into her bedroom? The smell had a sharp, acidic overtone too. She didn't know why, but she imagined this was what you smelled like after you had died, and you were lying in the suffocating darkness of your own coffin. A smell both pungent and sour. Although, how could you smell anything when your lungs were deflated, and you couldn't breathe, and your heart was empty, and your liquefying brain was trickling out of your ears? "Louise," she said, in a thick, clogged-up voice. She looked around, shocked. She had said, "Louise," but she hadn't spoken. The voice had come out of her throat, but she had felt that somebody was squeezing her larynx in their hand, and that was where her name had come from. It was a horrible, choking sensation. "Louise, look at me." She turned, and it was then that she saw the dark, smoky figure standing by the door. It wasn't completely opaque. She could make out the panels of the door through it, and the notice pinned up with her daily rosters on it. Yet she could clearly see its pointed hood and its long, dangling sleeves, and she thought she could see its eyes too, reflecting the light from her bedside lamp. "I sense that you wish yourself harm," she said. She wanted to scream at this figure that it couldn't be real, and to go, because she must be dreaming about it. But her lips and her tongue felt numb, like they did when she went to the dentist, and her lungs refused to fill with air, and it seemed as if she could only say the words that the hooded figure wanted her to say. "You must take care of yourself, Louise, because you are carrying my nestlings inside you. If you harm yourself, my nestlings will come to harm, and their lives are sacred. Your life is sacred too. Always remember that." Louise took a step toward the hooded figure. She wanted to flap her hand so that the smoke was dispersed, or at least to pull back its hood to see what it looked like. But her legs felt as numb as her lips, and when she tried to take another step, her brain couldn't work out how to make her legs work. The fetuses inside her had entangled themselves into her spinal cord and taken over her speech and her movement and even the beating of her heart. "You have thought of yourself as ugly," she said. "The cruel words of others have made you believe that your life has no value. But I tell you this, every single life has value. Every single life is sacred. Those children inside you were aborted and flushed away, but I was able to save them. Now you are bearing them for me, my nestlings, in a womb which I no longer possess." Louise felt another sharp pain and took a step back, and then sat down heavily on her bed. Her eyes were so blurred with tears that she could hardly see the hooded figure as it drifted closer, but she could smell it even more strongly. Wood smoke and lemons. "You will not have to carry my nestlings for long. I am invested with the power to turn their bodily clocks much faster than those of other children. You feel pain inside you mostly because they are growing so quickly, and within a week they will be ready to emerge. You will be a mother, Louise, the proud mother of different but sacred lives. Louise could do nothing but sit on her bed, rocking backward and forward because she was hurting so much. "You will not harm yourself," she said, and now her voice sounded even harsher and more threatening. "I forbid you to harm yourself under any circumstances. If you try to, you will know pain that makes this pain feel like nothing at all. Every nerve in your body will be ripped out one by one, and you will have to eat your own eyes." With that, the hooded figure began to collapse. It swirled around and was sucked under the door, and disappeared, although it left behind that distinctive sickening smell of smoke and lemons. Louise lay back on her bed, trembling uncontrollably, as if she had a fever. She could feel those fetuses turning around inside her and scraping at the lining of her womb, and her despair was total. How much worse could her life become if she wasn't even allowed to die? Chapter 35. Before he drove to Peckham the next morning, Jerry stopped off at Tooting Police Station. He had 3 minor investigations to catch up on, and he wanted to check the date of his next appearance at Wimbledon Magistrates' Court to give evidence in a case of car theft. As he walked into the entrance hall, PC Susan Lawrence called out, "Oh, DC Pardoe. DC Mallett's looking for you." "OK, love. How was your ice skating?" "Not much fun. Actually, it was a disaster. I slipped over about 100 times, and now I'm all over bruises." "You should come out with me next time. At least you'll get fed, and you won't end up looking like you're the victim of domestic violence." He went upstairs and found DC Mallett sitting at his desk, reading The Sun online and sipping a cup of Starbucks coffee. "How's it going, Edge? The lovely PC Lawrence said you wanted to see me." "Watcher, Jerry?" "Yes, that tweet you twatted about that old geezer you were looking for, the one you reckon set fire to your motor. Well, this woman's been in touch, and she says she knows him." "You're having a giraffe, aren't you?" "No," said DC Mallett, reaching across his desk and picking up a sheet of notepaper. "Her name's Mary Stebbings, and she lives in St. Norbert Road in Brockley. Here's her phone number. She says the old geezer's name was Malcolm Venables, and he used to live just across the road from her." "What do you mean, his name was Malcolm Venables? Has he changed it or something?" "No, he's dead. He died about a year ago." "It can't be him then, can it?" "That's what I told her, but she said she was sure it was him. 110% positive." Jerry stood holding the sheet of notepaper and biting his lip. This was ridiculous. It was obviously a case of mistaken identity. EvoFit was the most successful method yet invented for identifying criminals, but even so, it led to the arrest of only 6 offenders out of 10. Malcolm Venables must be one of the 4 out of 10 who'd been mistaken for somebody else. "How's it all going, this sewer business?" asked DC Mallett. "I haven't seen nothing about it in the news." "That's because it's all embargoed. But I tell you, Edge, it's a bleeding nightmare. Those deformed kids I was telling you about, we found nearly 24 of them in an old cesspit over in Blackheath, and now they're all at Evelina's Children's Hospital. You should see the state of them. No arms and no legs, some of them. One of them, he's only got half a brain, and the top of his bonce is flat as a pancake. I had to take a couple of Nitol last night, or I never would have got to sleep." "So, what you going to do about this Mary Stebbings? Give her a bell?" "I don't know. I'm on my way to Peckham later, so I could go via Brockley. I don't want to dismiss this completely out of hand. Maybe this Malcolm Venables has a brother who looks just like him. Or a cousin." "What about all them forensic officers what got killed?" "What's left of them is still at St. George's in the morgue. They were all chopped up into bits, but the pathologists haven't finished working out which bits belong to which other bits. And some of the bits are missing. Fingers, feet, even a couple of heads. There's sewage workers still combing through the slush to see if they can find them." "It's mad, isn't it?" I'm glad you're on it and not me. I'm still chasing that maxi drug gang over at Streatham, and that's enough to drive you mental. We had another gang-related stabbing last night, and some young bloke got his ear chopped off with a machete. Jerry went across to his own desk, leafed through the messages that had been left for him, and checked his PC for any reports. To his relief, there was nothing urgent. His insurance company had written to say that his car was a total write-off, but that was no surprise. He drove to Brockley and found the small terraced house on St Norbert Road where Mary Stebbings lived. When he rang the doorbell, she answered at once, almost as if she'd been expecting him. She was a small, 60-ish woman, with her hair pinned up in a bun, like a wire-wool pan scourer, and a droopy brown cardigan. Jerry reckoned he could have used the lenses in her glasses to start a campfire if the sun had been out. Mary Stebbings, Detective Constable Pardoe. Here's my ID. Oh, she said, peering at his warrant card. You've come about Malcolm. That's right. You told my colleague that you saw his picture on Twitter. I did, yes. No doubt about it. Do you want to come on inside? She led him through to a small, stuffy living room, clearly the best room, with china dogs in the fireplace and lace antimacassars on the back of the armchairs. It smelled of lavender and damp. Can I get you a cup of tea? She asked him. Oh, no thanks, I'm fine. I've got a lot on today. You know what they say, no peace for the wicked. Malcolm wasn't wicked. Malcolm was always very helpful. He used to put my bins out for me. Always smiling, too. When did he die, Mary? You don't mind if I call you Mary? November last year. November the 19th, because it was the day before my birthday. I saw him the day before, and he looked as fit as a fiddle, but he had one of those pulmonary embolisms. His daughter Penny said he went out like a light. 1 minute he was eating his cornflakes, the next he was dead as a doornail. Just shows you, doesn't it? Relish every moment, because you never know when it's going to be your turn next. Mary, it was me who posted that picture on Twitter. It's an old man I've seen several times in the past few days, walking around the streets of Peckham and Tooting and Denmark Hill. This old man was very much alive, so I don't think there's much chance that it could have been your Malcolm. I'm sure it was Malcolm. I took a long, hard look at it, and I'm sure. How's your eyesight? Very good, as a matter of fact. I know I wear these glasses, but I had my eyes tested at Specsavers only last week, and they said my vision was clear as a bell. Malcolm doesn't have a brother, does he? Or a cousin that you know of, who looks like him? Mary Stebbings shook her head. He mentioned an older sister, but she died a long time ago. Cancer, I think he said. And his wife had passed away too. In that case, the old man I saw must have been the spitting image of Malcolm, even if he wasn't Malcolm. It said on the Twitter that he was wearing a brown tweed coat. Malcolm always wore a brown tweed coat. You never saw him in nothing else, not in the winter anyway. He said it was his lucky coat because he was coming out of the Brockley Barge pub and he stopped for a moment to button it up. They were building a whole lot of new flats right opposite, and when he crossed the road, a load of bricks dropped down and missed him by inches. He always wore a brown tweed coat. That's right, his lucky coat. Another time when he was wearing it, he won £75 on a scratch card. They buried him in it. They buried him in it. Where? Deptford Park Cemetery. I saw him in his coffin wearing it. I went to the funeral myself. Jerry felt the same icy cold dread that had made him shiver when he was down the sewer in Blackheath. Malcolm Venables was dead. He had been dead for months. There was no possibility that Jerry could have seen him in the reception area at the King's College Hospital, or outside McDonald's in Peckham, or standing by the Evelina Children's Hospital, or on Tooting Beck Common. He was dead. Dead as a doughnut, as Jerry's late father used to say. Right, Mary. I won't take up any more of your time. That's all right. I haven't got anything to do all day anyway. Not since my Rodney got married and moved out. That's why I spend so much time on the Twitter. It's a blessing, that Twitter, if you're living on your own. Jerry knew he would have to go to Deptford Park Cemetery, even if there was no earthly possibility that Malcolm Venables could have been the old man in the brown tweed coat who he and Jamila had seen. The cemetery was in a fenced-off area on the east side of Deptford Park, surrounded by plane trees. Jerry parked in the street outside and pushed open the squeaking iron gate. A plaque by the entrance told him that it had originally been used for the burial of naval officers who had died at sea and who had no surviving relatives in England to give them a funeral. He was immediately taken by the cemetery's quietness, despite the traffic in the streets all around the park, and the aircraft flying low overhead. He was also struck by how neglected it was, its borders overgrown and cluttered with dead leaves, and the trees around it in need of trimming. He walked along the pathways between the graves. A light, chilly wind was blowing, so that the leaves scurried around his ankles. Most of the gravestones were plain marble or granite, and engraved with nothing more than the names of the men buried beneath them. A few of them were decorated with urns or railings, and 4 or 5 angels were standing with their wings folded and their heads bent in sorrow. Some of the gravestones had fallen over, and some had grown such thick pelts of moss that it was impossible to read what was written on them. Jerry found the grave of Malcolm Venables at the far end of the cemetery. It was one of a row of newer graves, although they were all overgrown with nettles. His headstone was light grey polished granite, with the inscription, Malcolm Arthur Venables, died November 19th, aged 81. Mal would always walk that extra mile, to help his friends and cheer them with a smile. This Malcolm Venables certainly didn't sound like the old man in the brown tweed coat that Jerry had encountered. That old man had smiled, yes, but his smile had been gloating rather than friendly. And if he had walked an extra mile, it had been to find Jerry and Jamila, so that the hooded figure and her children could attack them. What was noticeable, though, was that the centre of Malcolm Venables' grave was depressed to a depth of nearly a metre, unlike the other graves beside it. It looked to Jerry as if not enough soil had been shovelled into it when his coffin was buried, or else the ground beneath it had dramatically subsided after his interment, and nobody had bothered to fill it in. He was still standing in front of the grave when a short, middle-aged man in an olive-waxed jacket appeared around the corner of the pathway and came strolling straight up to him as if he knew him. The man's cheeks were reddened and rough, like somebody who spends a lot of his time outdoors, and he had a cast in one eye, so it was difficult to tell if he was looking directly at Jerry or over his left shoulder. "Paying your respects," he said. "I suppose you could call it that." "Not an old friend, then?" No." The man stood with his hands behind his back, looking around. "I must admit that we don't get an overwhelming number of people in here paying their respects. Sometimes days will go by and we don't even get one." "You work here, then?" "As part of my supervisory duties, yes." "Colin Burrows, that's me. If you ever need advice or assistance about parks or cemeteries." "Outdoor Recreational Facilities Administrator. That's my official title. What they used to call a park keeper." "It's got a lot of atmosphere, hasn't it, this cemetery? A hell of a lot of history, too, judging by the gravestones. I didn't even know it existed." "Oh, it goes right back to the days of Nelson. Lately it's all got rather run down, though, I'm sorry to say. Cuts in the council budget, that's the problem. What limited funds the council have these days, they'd rather spend on those residents who are still above ground." Jerry nodded toward Malcolm Venables' sunken grave. "What happened here, then? Had a bit of an earthquake, did you?" Colin Burrows let out a sharp bark of laughter that sounded like tough nut. No. That was your Thames Tideway, that was. They've been digging a new overflow tunnel, and it runs right underneath the cemetery. When it's all done, it's going to connect the Greenwich pumping station with the super sewer under the Thames. We've had 2 or 3 sinkholes appearing, and this is one of them. Once the tunnelling work's all completed, we'll be filling them all in, but it's not worth doing it yet. He pointed over to the trees that overhung the northwest side of the cemetery. Jerry could see that there was a line of orange plastic barriers underneath them, and what looked like a warning sign, although from this distance he couldn't read what it said. This hole's nothing, though, not compared with the one we've got over there. Nearly 10 metres deep, that one is. If any coffins had been buried there, they probably would have dropped down into the tunnel that they were digging. That would have given them a shock, wouldn't it? But there weren't any. Coffins, I mean. No. Nobody's been buried there since the cemetery first opened, and I don't think anybody ever will be. There's a story about that end of the cemetery, that it's cursed. They say that a witch's ashes were sprinkled there after she was burned at the stake. A witch? When? I don't know. It would have been more than 150 years ago, because that's as far as the records for this cemetery go back. And it's only a story. But they've always called that the witch's quarter acre. And they say that if you're buried there, your soul will never be able to escape from your coffin and go to heaven. I can't say I've ever heard that story before. No, I'm not surprised. We don't exactly go spreading it around. Colin Burrows took out a packet of cigarettes and offered one to Jerry. When Jerry shook his head, he shrugged and lit one, and stood puffing up smoke into the grey afternoon air. Jerry waited for him to tell him something more about the cemetery and its history, but he stayed silent and carried on smoking, one eye looking north and the other eye looking northeast. Perhaps he didn't know any more than he had already told him. "Okay if I take some pictures?" Jerry asked him. "Be my guest, Squire. Be my guest." Jerry took out his phone and filmed a short video of Malcolm Venable's headstone and the deep depression in his grave. Then he walked over and took more pictures of the sinkhole in the witch's quarter acre. Down at the bottom of the sinkhole, he could see tussocks of grass and lumps of soil, so it didn't appear as if it had collapsed completely into the drainage tunnel below it. As he was walking back, Colin Burrows beckoned him over. "I'll tell you one thing," he said, blowing smoke out through his nostrils. "I don't believe that old story about the witch, not for a single moment. Just an old wives' tale. But you won't catch me coming into the cemetery at night. Nor during a thunderstorm, neither." "Oh, no," said Jerry, with a smile. "What are you afraid of?" "What are we all afraid of?" said Colin Burrows, tapping his forehead with his finger. "The spooky things that go on inside here. The human brain. More like a chamber of horrors, if you ask me." Back at the station, Jamila listened in silence while Jerry told her about his visit to Mary Stebbings and to Deptford Park Cemetery. Then she sat back and said, "What do you think? It could be a coincidence that William Trench buried his witch-woman's smoke near Deptford Park, and that there's a story about a witch's ashes being scattered there. And it could be another coincidence that this Malcolm Venables should be buried so close nearby. 2 coincidences I could just about believe in," said Jerry. "But it's the brown tweed coat that clinched it for me, because that makes it 3. "I can understand that, Jerry, but if Malcolm Venables is dead, how could it have been him?" "Sarge, how could a woman made of nothing but smoke almost knock me unconscious? How could children with no arms and no legs and no stomachs stay alive in a cesspit even for 5 minutes? How could all those forensics officers get chopped into pieces and blown out into the street in a fountain of shit? I mean, Jesus, one old-age pensioner walking around Peckham when he's been dead since last November, that's practically normal by comparison." "Well, yes, you're right. But I don't know. The more we find out, the more bizarre this whole investigation seems to become. It's like some horrible story about demons that my grandmother used to tell me. It wasn't only the brown tweed coat. It was the sinkholes. William Trench wrote in his diary, didn't he, that he and his mates buried the witch woman's coffin 3 times as deep as a normal grave and piled a whole lot of concrete and stuff on top of it. They did that so it would be almost impossible to dig it up. But that means it would have been a whole lot closer to the tunnel that the Thames Tideway engineers were digging underneath. Supposing the roof of the tunnel collapsed and the witch woman's coffin fell down into the tunnel. She would still have been locked inside it with those 72 locks. How would she have got out? You remember what Alan Pattinson said? Nobody could turn those keys except for priests, or people whose hearts had stopped beating and then started up again, or the witch's children, natural or adopted. If any of those kids had already been down in the sewers, they could have opened the locks around her coffin and got her out. You really think some of those children could have been living down in the sewers before she escaped from her coffin? I'm only guessing, Sarge, but we've both seen what kind of power she has. Maybe she was able to keep them alive even when she was still locked up inside it. Who knows? Jamila stood up and went to the window. We can't allow this to continue. We have to do what William Trench did and hunt her down and lock her away for good. Or better still, destroy her completely so that she can never come back in any shape or form. But how do we find her? And, more to the point, how do we destroy her? She is nothing but smoke. Didn't you say that your granny used to know all about ghosts? What were they called? Churls. They can be made out of smoke too. But churls are Pakistani spirits. And besides, my grandmother passed away a long time ago. There's nobody in your family who might be able to do a spot of exorcism for us? Perhaps, but I couldn't ask any of them to risk their lives, and I truly believe they would be risking their lives if they tried to catch her. Whatever she really is, and wherever she gets her strength from, this witch woman is more malicious than any murderer I have ever had to go after. Jamila paused, and then she said, As it is, Jerry, I believe that both you and I are in considerable danger. It seems as if she knows how to find us, wherever we are. We could so easily have been burned to death in your car, and she might try it again at any time. For all we know, she could burn us to death in this room, while we are talking, or tonight, while we are sleeping in our beds. Oh, cheers. I'm having enough trouble getting to Kip as it is. But if we're going to catch her and put her out of action, I reckon we need to do exactly what William Trench says he did, don't you think? Number 1, we need a dog, which won't be any problem. We could always use Tough Nut, my ex-wife Staffy, if she'll let us. Number 2, we need a priest who can do exorcisms. I was reading about it the other day, and apparently the Vatican still insists that every Catholic diocese has a priest trained in driving out devils. Even if we can find a priest, we will still have to convince him to help us. Come on, Sarge. You can persuade anybody to do anything. You only had to flutter your eyelashes at DCI Waters, and he approved all that overtime. Jerry, said Jamila. All right, sorry. But I don't think we'll have too much of a problem getting hold of a priest. We won't need the yew twigs and the whale oil, because the witch has been cremated already. Apart from which, I don't have a clue where we could find any whale oil. I've never seen any in Lidl. But, number 3, we'll need a coffin with 72 locks to shut her up in. With any luck, we'll find that somewhere down in the Greenwich Overflow Tunnel. You really think so? We can but try. I'll give that Gemma Bright a bell and see what she has to say about it. She's the expert when it comes to finding things down drains. And what about this Malcolm Venables? This old man in his brown tweed coat? It could be that his coffin dropped down into the tunnel as well, and that's why there's such a bloody great dent in his grave. If it didn't, we'll have to get a court order to have his coffin dug up, if only to make sure that he's still in it. And I know what you're going to ask next. What if he isn't still in it? Then, for the first time in my life, I shall have to seek an arrest warrant for a man who is dead. Chapter 36. DCI Walters came in looking more like a bird of prey than usual. He had cut himself shaving, and had stuck a pink plaster to the side of his chin, but it had come loose and waggled when he spoke. "We've got ourselves a bit of a problem," he announced. "A bit of a problem?" said Jerry. "That's the understatement of the century." "The problem I'm talking about, Pardoe, is that the media have got onto this. Somebody at St. George's Hospital has tipped them off that the forensic officers who were fatally injured in the sewer in Peckham didn't die by accident. The pathologist has found that they weren't dismembered by water pressure or any kind of gas explosion. They were deliberately cut apart by what must have been some kind of a saw." "Even we haven't been told that yet," said Jamila. "I've already been on to the pathologist about it. He apologised for the leak and said that he'll be sending us his full report later this afternoon. He doesn't know who leaked it, but he has a fair idea, and he's going to look into it. He said that when he finds out who is responsible, heads are going to roll." "That's an appropriate way of putting it, under the circumstances," said Jerry. "That's not all," said DCI Walters. "Somebody at Evelina's Children's Hospital has spilled the beans about the children you rescued. The media don't have the full details, but they know that there's a number of sick children being kept in isolation, and that they've all been put into an induced coma. A reporter from the Daily Telegraph asked me why it was necessary to have armed officers preventing people from going up to the 6th floor, and why a police dog was guarding the ward." "What did you tell them?" asked Jamila. "As far as the forensic officers were concerned, I said that we were still waiting for a full post-mortem report, and until then I couldn't comment. As far as the children were concerned, I said that they were suffering from a serious illness that medical experts had not yet been able to identify, but we were keeping them isolated to prevent the possibility of it spreading any further." "And how did the press react to that?" "They were very persistent, I'll give them that. They kept asking what kind of a serious illness, and where had it come from. Was it like Ebola or something like that? But they got no more details out of me. The last thing we want is a public panic." "We were coming up to see you anyway, sir," Jamila put in. "DC Pardoe has turned up some information that may help us to make some real progress with this investigation." "I can't guarantee it," said Jerry, "but, you never know." He told DCI Walters about the cemetery and the witch's quarter-acre. DCI Walters sat and listened, like a man who doesn't want to believe anything that he's being told, but knows he has no alternative, because nothing else that he has yet heard makes any sense. "We're planning to go down into the tunnel and see if we can find that coffin," Jamila told him. "If we can do that, we might at least have some way of holding our offender, always supposing that we can catch her." DCI Walters looked at her for a long time before he answered. "Offender," he repeated at last. "That's the first time I've ever heard a puff of smoke called an offender. Every day that passes, the happier I am that you're the front-line investigators in this case, and not me." Jamila called Gemma at Crane's Drains. Gemma agreed to get in touch with the engineering contractors who were digging the overflow tunnel between Greenwich and Chambers Wharf. "I'm sure they'll let us go down and take a look," Gemma told her. "It's possible that the coffin could have dropped down into the excavation. They're digging the tunnel with this massive boring machine called Annie, that's about as wide as 2 London buses. It creeps along about 4 metres an hour, and the engineers line the tunnel behind it with these precast concrete panels. Maybe the coffin fell through before they'd had the chance to do that. Something similar happened when they were digging the Channel Tunnel, and water started to pour through the ceiling. Well, we'll have to check anyway, Jamila told her. If you can get a team together sometime later today, that would be great. No problem. They're working on that tunnel 24 hours a day, and I know the engineer in charge, so there shouldn't be any difficulty in us getting access. Almost as soon as she had put down her phone, it warbled again. It was PC Dyer, calling from the Children's Hospital. PC Dyer, is everything okay? You need to get here right away, Sergeant. There's something very weird happening. What do you mean by very weird? Are the children still in a coma? Yes, but it's like we're seeing things. I don't like to say ghosts. When you say you're seeing things, is that all of you or just you? All of us. The doctors and the nurses too. Very well, we'll be right with you. Jerry had been prodding at his phone and catching up with his WhatsApp messages. He looked up and said, "Don't tell me. It's something else bloody scary." PC Dyer says they're seeing ghosts. Jerry dropped his head forward in resignation. This is never going to end, is it? We're going to be fighting this bleeding witch until we're drawing our pensions. He shrugged on his raincoat, and the two of them clattered downstairs to the car park. As he started the Datsun's engine, Jerry said, "Just one thing, Sarge. If you see that old fella in the brown tweed coat, or even somebody who looks like him, shout out. I don't fancy getting barbecued a second time." He drove at high speed to the Children's Hospital, with the Datsun's blue light flashing, and one or two quick bursts on the siren. When they arrived, they found that the two armed officers guarding the lifts were both looking confused and edgy. "Don't exactly know what's going on up there, Sarge, but they've warned us to watch out for any intruders." "Yes, you need to," said Jamila. "Keep your eyes open, in particular for an old man in a brown coat. He looks quite harmless, but his appearance is deceptive. Quite apart from him, though, do not let anybody up to any of the floors unless they are a member of staff and have ID. And I mean nobody. No visitors, not until we give you the all clear." "Okay, got you." Jerry and Jamila said nothing to each other as they went up in the lift. They didn't even look at each other. On the 6th floor, as before, they found the paediatricians and the nurses and the police officers milling around in the corridor, all of them looking as rattled as the two armed officers down in reception. PC Maitland was still there, with Blizzard, and even Blizzard appeared to be nervous, clawing impatiently at the floor and repeatedly lifting up his hindquarters, even though he'd been ordered to sit. Gemma and Jerry went up to PC Dyer, who was standing by the doors of Peaceful Ward, peering in through the windows. She had that strained expression on her face that Jerry had seen before on young constables when they encountered a bizarre and frightening situation for which they hadn't been prepared at Hendon Training College. "There," she said. "If they're not ghosts, what are they?" Jamila and Jerry looked into the ward. The children were still lying on their beds, each of them deeply asleep and covered in a light blue hospital blanket. Yet, sitting up on every bed, there was another figure, adult-sized, but physically afflicted in exactly the same way. A grown-up version of the comatose child lying beneath it. These figures were little more than watery outlines, and Jerry could see right through them, but they were distinct enough for him to be able to make out their faces and their various malformations. Several of them were moving, turning their heads and lifting their arms as if they were swimming, and at least 3 of them were opening and closing their mouths, although Jerry couldn't hear anything. "It's them, isn't it?" said Jamila, her voice hushed with awe. "It's the children, only grown up." Dr. Latimer came up behind them. "As soon as they appeared, I told all the nursing staff to clear the ward. I have no idea if they're dangerous or not. I've never seen anything like them. But after that last outburst of violence, I don't want to take any chances." Jamila bit her lip thoughtfully, and then she said, "Let's go in. I'd like to see how they react to us, if at all. It could be that they're nothing more than holograms. Maybe somebody has found a way of projecting images remotely. If so, it's possible that we could trace where they're being sent from." Dr. Latimer looked dubious. "How would anybody else know what their deformities are? We've kept a total security blackout ever since the children were first brought here." "Nothing in this investigation is logical, Doctor," said Jamila. "We've stopped trying to discount any lines of inquiry simply because they don't make sense." Jerry pushed open the doors, and they stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was how chilly it was. It was like walking into the freezer at the back of the butcher's shop where he had worked on Saturdays when he was at school. The windows were white with frost, although the sun was still shining through them, and their breath smoked. Jamila and Jerry approached the first bed cautiously, with Dr. Latimer close behind them. They could see the flattened head of the boy who was lying under the blanket, and the phantom figure that was sitting up on top of him had a flattened head too. Its eyes were opaque, and its mouth was dragged down at the sides, although it kept opening and closing its jaw as if it were chewing a lump of gristle. Jerry went up close to the figure. It slowly turned its head and stared back at him, its jaw still opening and closing. "Who are you?" Jerry asked it, although he knew that it was probably futile trying to talk to it if it was nothing but a hologram. The figure kept on staring at him and chewing, and then suddenly it flung up both of its arms and screamed at him. A scream that sounded like the blade of a knife being dragged along a railway line. Jerry stumbled back, but the figure kept on screaming, and then all of the other phantom figures in the ward began to scream too. The noise was so piercing that he couldn't hear himself think. Both Jamila and Dr. Latimer had their hands pressed to their ears, and Jamila shouted, "Come on, let's get out of here, before we go deaf." The three of them pushed their way back out into the corridor. As the doors swung shut behind them, the screaming sank down to a quivering whistle, and then died out altogether. P.C. Dyer and Andrew Tanner and the ward sister came hurrying up to them, and Andrew Tanner said, "My God, Ted, what are those things?" I couldn't even begin to tell you," said Dr. Latimer. He was visibly shaken. "Maybe there's some kind of optical illusion, but I can't imagine what makes them scream like that." Jerry looked back through one of the windows. The phantom figures were still sitting on the beds, although now their heads were bowed as if they were meditating, or praying, or beginning to fall asleep. "What do you think, Sarge?" "I think we should wait and see. Maybe they will fade away of their own accord. If they stay for much longer, I might call for the drone unit to see if they can jam the signal. That's if they are being created by a signal." The ward sister said, "In the meantime, I think my nurses here can all take a break. They've had quite enough stress for one morning. We have to deal with some heart-rending cases here, believe me, but we've never had to cope with anything like this." They were still talking when Blizzard abruptly barked, and then growled, and then scrabbled his claws on the floor. His handler said, "Sit, Blizzard." I said, "Sit." Jerry turned around and couldn't stop himself giving a shiver. Standing in the corridor, less than 10 meters away, was the white-haired old man in the brown tweed coat. The old man lifted one hand and smiled, and then he called out, "There you are. I guessed you'd be in here somewhere." His voice was oddly muffled, like somebody with a scarf wrapped over his mouth. "Right. You!" Jerry snapped at him, and started to stride toward him. "You're nicked, you are, sunshine." He had taken only 3 or 4 steps when, close behind the old man, a dark cloud of smoke began to fill the corridor. Blizzard barked even more hysterically and bounced up and down, and Jerry slowed down and then stopped. The smoke rolled around and rapidly took on the shape of the hooded woman, her arms outstretched so wide that they reached both sides of the corridor. The peak of her hood almost touched the ceiling. "What in the effing F is that?" said P.C. Maitland. He was straining so hard to keep Blizzard in check that he was leaning backward and digging in his heels. "And where did that old bloke come from? We're not supposed to be letting anybody up here, are we?" Before Jerry or Jamila could answer, P.C. Dyer spoke in the harsh, unmistakable tones of the witch-woman. Jerry looked around at her, and he could see how shocked she was that she was speaking at all, and even more by the words that were coming out of her mouth. "I have come to take my nestlings home." "Not a chance," Jamila retorted, although Jerry could hear how stressed she was. "Do not try to defy me. I have shown you how they will grow and what they will become. Now you must leave them alone and let them lead their own sacred lives, not the lives that you think you can impose on them." Jamila stepped forward, her arms by her sides, both fists clenched. "You are not taking them. You have destroyed enough lives already. We are going to take care of them for as long as they live, which will not be long. But we are not going to let them go back to live in a sewer." "The sewer is their home. It was the fat in the sewer that fed them before they set me free. You call that fat waste. For my nestlings it is nourishment. Now, stand aside, and I will take them back where they belong." "Oh, yes? And how do you propose to do that?" Jerry challenged her. "There's 22 of them in there." "They are mine. They are my nestlings. Without me, they never could have lived any life at all." "You should let her have 'em," shouted the old man in the brown tweed coat, although he still sounded muffled. "They ain't yours, them kids. You ain't got no right." The hooded figure kept on rolling and swirling as if she were agitated, but she didn't approach any closer. Jerry laid his hand on P.C. Maitland's shoulder and said, "Go on. Give them a bit of Blizzard." P.C. Maitland bent down and unclipped Blizzard's collar, and Blizzard shot off along the corridor like a bullet fired from a gun. He went for the old man in the brown tweed coat first, leaping on top of him and knocking him sideways onto the floor. The hooded figure did nothing to defend the old man, but shrank further back, her clouds of smoke becoming more and more turbulent. Jerry could see that he had been right, and that she was afraid of dogs, especially ferocious dogs like Tough Nut and Blizzard. The old man flapped one arm, trying to beat Blizzard off him, but Blizzard growled and gripped his sleeve between his teeth, shaking his head violently from side to side. The tweed was so fragile that Blizzard ripped it into shreds, and when he tossed his head back, he wrenched the old man's arm completely out of its socket. This excited Blizzard so much that he went berserk. He snarled and tore at the old man's throat, pulling out strings of dried flesh and tendons. But there was no blood. Jerry could see that the old man was desiccated, almost mummified. Blizzard bit with a crunch right through his spinal cord, and the old man's head rolled off and tumbled across the floor, ending up with his face against a radiator. Now Blizzard turned his attention to the hooded witch-woman, his tail erect, and his hind legs trembling as if he were sexually aroused. The witch-woman was gradually retreating down the corridor, waving her smoky sleeves slowly from side to side, as if that might keep Blizzard from coming any closer. "You will regret this," said P.C. Dyer, coming forward and standing so close to Jerry and Jamila that she was almost touching them. You will be punished for it. I swear in the name of original sin. You think you can take my nestlings away from me? Nobody can take my nestlings away from me. If I cannot have them, nobody can have them. Nobody. Her sleeves waved more wildly, making a soft rumbling sound, as if they were being blown by a hurricane. Even Blizzard took 2 or 3 steps back. P.C. Dyer screamed out something that sounded like amulet, and then there was a devastating bang from Peaceful Ward, so loud that Jerry thought his eardrums had burst. The doors were ripped off their hinges and crashed into the paediatricians and nurses and police officers gathered outside, knocking several of them up against the opposite wall, and some of them onto the floor. Out of the ward roared a huge billow of green fire, searingly hot. The flames filled the corridor, scorching everybody in it, and devouring all the oxygen like some ravenous dragon. Jerry grabbed Jamila's arm and pulled her away, and between them they stumbled toward the lifts. They were only halfway there, when the flames shrank back into the ward, although they were still burning fiercely inside. Jerry looked further down the corridor. Blizzard had stopped chasing the witch woman for a moment, distracted by the flames bursting out, but now he was after her again, furiously barking. The witch woman was backing away, still waving her sleeves. She passed the lifts and retreated as far as the stairwell, and then she collapsed and folded up and dropped down onto the floor. Her smoke poured away between the banisters and vanished. Blizzard reached the top of the stairs and stood there baffled, his ears erect and his fur bristling, unable to understand how the witchwoman could have simply slid away out of his sight. Jerry and Jamila turned back toward the ward. The paediatricians and the nurses and the police officers were climbing back onto their feet, their faces reddened and their hair singed and their clothes still smoking. Inside the ward, every one of the 22 beds was on fire, consumed by raging green flames that twisted and danced and leaped up almost as high as the ceiling. The witch woman's nestlings were being cremated alive. The ward sister, her cap askew, had already called for the fire brigade. P.C. Maitland came hurrying toward them, lugging a fire extinguisher that he had found at the opposite end of the corridor. He pulled the pin and aimed it at the flames, but the heat was so intense that there was little he could do except spray dry powder into the middle of the open doorway. Until the firefighters arrived, all they could do was stand and watch the beds blaze. There was no sign of the phantom figures, and they saw no movement from the children. There was no more screaming either. The only sounds were the crackling of fire and a strange mournful twanging as the fabric of each of the mattresses was burned away and their springs uncoiled. Nobody spoke, not even to share their feeling that these children should never have survived anyway, and that it was a tragic blessing that their lives should have ended, although not like this. Abruptly and belatedly, the sprinklers in the ceiling started to rain down water all along the ward. They continued gushing until the green flames dipped and guttered and dwindled, and one after another all the fires were put out. The 22 beds were left blackened and sodden and smoking, like 2 rows of funeral biers. 5 firefighters arrived with the noisy bustle of waterproof fire kit, although there was no more fire for them to extinguish. While they were making sure that there was no chance of any of the smouldering mattresses bursting into flame again, Jerry and Jamila walked slowly down the middle of the ward. There was little left on each of the beds, except for springs and ashes and rib cages and other assorted bones. The smoke was as thick as a winter fog. "That witch woman," said Jamila, shaking her head. She is just like those terrorists who would rather kill their own children than let the infidels have them. They went back out into the corridor. Jerry nodded towards the body of the old man in the brown tweed coat, his head still lying next to the radiator. I bet that was him, that Malcolm Venables. I mean, the way Blizzard could just pull him apart like that. I reckon that witch brought him back to life like a zombie. I'll have Lambeth test him for DNA anyhow. Jamila wiped her eyes. It is urgent that we find her now, before she can cause any more death and damage. Those poor children. They should never have been alive, but she was right in a way. Since they were alive, their lives were sacred. Jerry shrugged. I think we've got her on the run, though. All we've got to do now is find her, and like you say, Sarge, have some way of neutralising her once we have. Neutralising? That's a very non-committal way of putting it. Well, yes, but you can't arrest smoke, can you? You can't put handcuffs on it, and you can't taser it, and you can't shoot it. P.C. Maitland came up to them, his face smudged with soot. Poor old Blizzard. He's still sniffing around, wondering where that smoky woman went. But I thought you'd like to know that we can probably track her down when you're ready. He held up a white hospital hand towel with a black smear on it. Her smoke left a residue on the walls. It has quite a strong smell to it, too. If ever she turns up again, it won't matter where, Blizzard and some of our other dogs will be able to track her down. I'll tell you something about Blizzard. If somebody's frying sausages 5 miles away, he can smell it. And it's all I can do to stop him from tearing off trying to find them. He passed the hand towel to Jamila, and Jamila sniffed it. Then she gave it to Jerry. Wood smoke and lemons, he said. That's her, all right. Now, we need to find her a coffin, and a priest, and we'll have everything we need to get her banged up. Chapter 37. They didn't get back to Peckham Police Station for another 3 hours. When they did, though, Jerry found to his surprise that the Reverend Dennis O'Sullivan was waiting for him. He was upstairs in their office, leafing through a copy of Police magazine. I was passed the message that you wanted to speak to me about exorcism, he said, in a very precise Sligo accent. I happened to be here in Peckham this afternoon visiting St. Thomas's, so I thought I'd call in. The young lady downstairs told me that you wouldn't be too long. The Reverend O'Sullivan was deacon of the Church of Our Lady of Eternal Grief in Nunhead. Jerry had tried to contact him earlier because the diocese office had informed him that he was the only practicing exorcist south of the river. He was short and balding, with large ears and dramatically sprouting eyebrows. He wasn't wearing a dog collar, but he was dressed all in black. Black shirt, black suit, and black overcoat. And there was a black bucket hat on the table next to him. Jamila went off to the toilet to wash, while Jerry said, Do sit down, Reverend. I appreciate your calling in. You haven't been waiting too long, have you? I was planning on paying you a visit this evening as it was. No, said the Reverend O'Sullivan. I've been here only 20 minutes, and I have all the time in the world. He sat down and laced his fingers together, leaning forward with a concerned expression on his face, as if he expected Jerry to start confessing that he had committed adultery, or stolen a 6-pack of Stella from his local off-licence. Sorry I pen and ink a bit, said Jerry. D.S. Patel and I have just been attending a rather tragic fire. A fire? Dear heaven, did somebody lose their life? It's all part of the reason I wanted to talk to you, Reverend. I don't suppose you get many people contacting you about exorcisms, but I think you'll understand when I've explained exactly why. Well, you may not credit it, but I've had 4 or 5 parishioners asking about exorcisms recently. More than usual. We live in such a godless world these days that people believe that demons are running amok. And I think that too. Once you close the door on God, you open the door for the devil. Jerry quickly gave the Reverend O'Sullivan all the historical background, about the witch woman and how William Trench had burned her and sealed her smoke in a coffin. He mentioned her apparent fear of dogs. Then he went on to tell him about the malformed children, the Fatberg, and the deaths of all the forensic officers in the sewer, as well as the mutilation of Martin Elliot and the skinning of Dr. MacLeod. The Reverend O'Sullivan listened with his eyes closed, although he nodded from time to time to indicate that he was concentrating and not bored or half asleep. When Jerry had finished describing this afternoon's fire at the Evelina Children's Hospital, he crossed himself and opened his eyes. "You're not making any of this up, are you?" he asked. "No, Reverend. I know it all sounds stark-staring bonkers, but every word of it is true. The only reason you haven't read about it in the papers or seen it on the news is because we've imposed a very strict media embargo. I'm also going to ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement before you leave here." "I believe you," said the Reverend O'Sullivan. "I've read about this kind of thing in the books I studied for exorcism. Aborted children being revived, although I've not heard about it being done recently. The thinking behind it was that they would resent God, because they would feel that he had turned his back on them. They weren't growing in his image, as all children are supposed to, and that is why they had been terminated. But if they could be brought back to life by satanic witchcraft, they would be so grateful that they would become the devil's willing servants." He paused, and then he said, "Tell me, did this William Trench happen to mention the witch woman's name?" "No, not as far as I know. Alan Pattinson only had the diary on loan. If he hasn't returned it yet, I could give him a bell and ask him. But I didn't see a name mentioned in any of the bits I read. He called her the witch woman, that was all." "It would be most helpful to know who she was, since you say that this William Trench believed her to be the most powerful witch that England has ever known. More than one witch claimed in the 16th and 17th centuries that they were the most powerful. But women who were rash enough to profess that they were witches were usually mentally unstable, since the consequence usually was that they were burned at the stake, or drowned in the village pond, or stoned to death." At that moment, Jamila came back into the office, smelling of Titan Celeste perfume. Jerry knew what it was, because he had sent it to her on her last birthday, on the recommendation of another Pakistani woman officer. The Reverend O'Sullivan says it would help him to find out the witch woman's name. But we don't know it, do we? Have you told him everything else? About the keys, with the demon's sigils on them? About those ghosts we saw at the hospital? About Martin Elliot being taken away and having his legs cut off? Everything. Did you tell him about the message that Martin Elliot wrote to us before he died? Oh, no, I forgot about that. But I don't think that meant anything anyway. He wrote cave, and then he wrote friendship. That was all. According to the doctor, he was really worried that he hadn't told us before, but by then he wasn't exactly the full shilling, if you know what I mean. Like I told you, he'd been blinded, as well as having his legs amputated. The Reverend O'Sullivan was staring at Jerry as if Jerry had just blasphemed. He wrote cave and then friendship. That's right. Did you know that when people are possessed by a demon or other malevolent being, they are unable to tell anybody else the name of that demon or other malevolent being? They are simply incapable of saying it. No, I didn't know that. But I suppose if I was a demon, I wouldn't want anybody to know it either, in case somebody like you came along and exorcised me. But did you know that in the few minutes before people die, they are returned to God, no matter what they have done? And in those few minutes, they can speak the name of the demon or the other malevolent being who possesses them. And in those few minutes, that demon or other malevolent being no longer has the power to keep them silent, or to punish them. I can't say that I knew that either, to be honest with you. What do you think this unfortunate man meant when he wrote cave? I guessed he was telling us that the children were hiding in a cave. As it turned out, it was an abandoned cesspit. Cave, in Latin, means beware. And if he was warning you to beware, I'm not at all surprised. Especially if friendship didn't mean friendship in the sense of camaraderie. Friendship was the name of Adeliza Friendship, who is recorded in the Vatican Library as having been the only mortal woman to have been mistress of Satan. Jerry and Jamila looked at each other, and then back to the Reverend O'Sullivan. "The mistress of Satan," said Jamila. "Surely Satan is imaginary, a theological concept. How can a woman be the mistress of a theological concept?" "You're wrong," said the Reverend O'Sullivan, shaking his head emphatically. "It was Pope Francis who said that Satan is not a diffuse thing. He is not like a mist. That's what Pope Francis said. He is a person. Look it up for yourself if you don't believe me." "So this Adeliza Friendship was Satan's mistress? Is that why she was the most powerful witch that ever was?" "Exactly. Satan lavished everything on her. He gave her gifts beyond all imagination. The gift of prediction. The gift of lighting fires by spontaneous combustion, which you've witnessed for yourselves. The gift of healing the sick, because she could kill viruses even before anybody knew that viruses existed. The gift of curing the mad, because she could shrink brain tumours, even before anybody knew about brain tumours. Above all, he gave her the power to raise the dead." "That old man who kept following us around, he really could have been Malcolm Venables then?" "From what you've told me, it's not only possible but highly likely. Adeliza Friendship would always have had a familiar. Not a black cat like witches in storybooks, but a dead person she had resurrected. They would do all her dirty work for her, cleaning her house for her, running errands, spying on her enemies. They would be so grateful to her for bringing them back to life that they would do anything for her. They also knew that if they disobeyed her, they would be shut back up in their coffins before they could blink." "And you really believe that this smoky figure could be her? Or some kind of ghost of her?" "You said that she was frightened by your dog. That helped to convince me. One of the better-known stories about Adeliza Friendship is that she renewed the ancient pagan tradition of sacrificing dogs to cure children born with birth defects." "They really used to do that?" "Oh, yes. Thousands of dogs were sacrificed in China and Greece and Hungary right up until the 12th century. But you can't commit mass murder against a whole species without that species seeking revenge, as the priests of China and Greece and Hungary found out to their cost. And Adeliza Friendship too. It was said that dogs would ruthlessly attack her wherever she went." Jamila said, "I'm not sure I can take this all in. She was actually Satan's mistress. But doesn't Satan have horns and a tail and live in hell?" "Of course not. As Pope Francis said, he's a person, a very evil person, in the sense that he has a human shape. But he still has command of all the demons of hell. And those demons can possess people so that they do Satan's work for him. That's why he wants to revive all those aborted fetuses, so that they will always be his children." "I still can't understand how it's done," said Jamila. "I can understand the science of reviving people by CPR or electric shock. But those aborted fetuses, some of them were found back in their mothers' wombs, or in other women's wombs." "That's right. If they had been aborted before they had developed enough to survive for any sustained period of time outside the womb, Adeliza Friendship would return them to the wombs of their original mothers. Or, if that was impracticable, to the woman of any other woman who could be used as a surrogate mother. Then again, if a fetus was capable of independent movement, it might seek out a surrogate mother by itself. Even from a distance, Adeliza Friendship would be able to invest it with the power to crawl, and to find what you might call a nest. Yes, said Jamila. We've had several cases of that. Now they begin to make some sort of sense. Maybe sense is not the right word, but at least we can understand what's been going on and why. There's a book in the Vatican Library, Progenium Nidosque Diaboli Est Scriptor, the Reverend O'Sullivan told her. It literally means the devil's nestlings, and it describes in full how aborted fetuses were revived, and then inserted by so-called witches into the wombs of innocent women while they slept. Either that, or they crawled in by themselves. The practice of airing beds by throwing back the covers was not originally done to dry the sheets after a night's sleep, but to make sure that there were no aborted fetuses lurking under the blankets. That was one of the reasons duvets became so popular. It was so much easier to check for some unwelcome visitor hiding in your bed. While he was talking, Jamila had switched on her computer and Googled Adeliza Friendship. Apart from the text describing her as the most notorious self-proclaimed witch of the 19th century, there were several engravings. One was of Adeliza Friendship herself, staring directly at the viewer. She had huge eyes and high cheekbones and a sensual mouth, and her hair was elaborately pinned up in braids. Her left hand was lifted with her fingers parted in the sign of Satan. Another picture, a crude woodcut, showed her dressed in a voluminous skirt and dancing with the devil. Unlike the devil that the Reverend O'Sullivan had described, this devil had horns and a tail and cloven hoofs, and was carrying a trident. Jerry studied the pictures and read the text. It made no mention of William Trench and how he had burned Adeliza Friendship. It said only that she had disappeared one day in September 1859 and that nobody knew what had become of her. "She's a looker, though, isn't she?" said Jerry. "If I bumped into her in my local, I'd have a go at chatting her up, I can tell you." "Even if she wasn't made of smoke, Jerry, she's already spoken for," said Jamila. Then she turned to the Reverend O'Sullivan. "Before she set fire to those poor children, Reverend, she shouted out, 'Amulet,' or something like it. Do you have any idea what that could have meant?" The Reverend O'Sullivan thought for a moment, and then he said, "It's possible that she was calling on the demon Adramelech. In the Bible, it is mentioned that the Sepharvites used to make sacrifice to Adramelech by burning their children alive. So, even though she killed them, what she did would have met with Satan's approval." "You know what we're going to ask you, Reverend, don't you?" "Yes, of course. I can't say that I've ever performed an exorcism on anybody who's already been exorcised once before, and cremated, and who's nothing more substantial than smoke. She obviously has extraordinary powers, and I think I can say with some certainty that those powers come directly from Satan himself, her lover." He frowned at his bucket hat for a moment, as if he expected it to move or to speak to him. "I've exorcised what I believe to be real demons before now. A secondary school teacher in Bermondsey was possessed by the demon Crokel, who had taken over her brain by the cunning use of numbers. I was able to dismiss him by decoding his numbers, almost like cleaning malware out of a hard drive. I have to admit, though, that I've never had to face Satan himself. It frightens me, to be truthful. Satan has a reputation for emptying the minds of anybody who tries to challenge him, so that they lose all of their memories, all of their emotions, all of their personality. They stay alive, but they might as well be dead." "Will you do it, though?" asked Jamila. The Reverend O'Sullivan looked at her and gave her a weary smile. "This is obviously what my whole life has been leading up to. This is why I was born, and this is why I took the cloth, and then went on to study exorcism. This is my date with destiny. You ask me if I'll do it, but I have no choice." "Don't get too doomy about it," said Jerry. "We've got to find her first." Chapter 38. They were still talking to the Reverend O'Sullivan when Jamila's phone rang, and she was told that Gemma had arrived in reception, along with Jim Feather and 2 flushers. As soon as they had all come upstairs and crowded into their office, Gemma said, "Here we are. Ready when you are." "If you can give us just a few minutes," said Jamila. "We have had a deeply disturbing day today, and we are still trying to recover from it. This, by the way, is the Reverend O'Sullivan. I suppose you could call him our spiritual advisor." "I think that's just what we need, a spiritual advisor," said Gemma. "You're not going to believe this, but I've been in touch with the contractors digging the Greenwich overflow, Argent Pell. I know their chief engineer, Dan Beavis. He's the best in the business, Dan. He was one of the leading engineers on Crossrail. And guess what he told me? They did find a coffin when they were digging under Deptford Park. 2 coffins, in fact." "You're joking, aren't you?" said Jerry. "How come that wasn't reported?" "It wasn't reported because it happened in the middle of the night, about 2:30 a.m. as a matter of fact. One coffin fell into the tunnel almost as soon as the boring machine had passed by, and the other one approximately 20 minutes later. They were stacked by the side of the tunnel so that they could be picked up and loaded onto the maintenance train the following day. But the following day, they were gone." "Gone? Gone where?" "That's what Dan said they couldn't work out. The tunnellers on the night shift began to think that they might have dreamed it. They weren't drunk, because they're not allowed to take alcohol down the tunnel, although they have been known to inject vodka into an apple or a banana using a hypodermic syringe." "This gets more loony by the minute," said Jerry. "Disappearing coffins and alcoholic bananas. I think I need a holiday." Gemma said, "Dan told me that they didn't report the coffins, partly because there was no sign of them, but mostly because it would have meant stopping work while the police were called to investigate where they might have gone. And the tunnelling contract is on such a tight schedule. Even stopping for a few hours would have cost them tens of thousands. Each tunneller gets paid nearly £600 a day, plus a bonus if they beat their target." "I'm in the wrong job," said Jerry. "Mind you, I'm claustrophobic, especially down those sewers." Dan admitted that he'd put the coffins completely out of his mind. He'd had far too many other things to worry about. When I called him, though, he'd started thinking seriously about where they could have disappeared to. They couldn't have been lifted out of the tunnel by way of the main entrance shaft at Greenwich, because somebody would have seen them. But there's an overflow duct between the tunnel and the existing Deptford main sewer, which is just about wide enough to push a coffin through. Dan said that if there had been enough people to lift them, they could have been carried out of the tunnel, pushed through the overflow and into the sewer. After that, they could have been taken anywhere. "It's all very well saying enough people," Jerry put in, "but what people? If it was the tunnellers, why would they even do that?" "Think about it the other way round," said Jamila. "What if the people who took the coffins were down in the sewers already? Every one of those tunnellers would have been totally preoccupied with their work, wouldn't they? Because it's so hard and so dangerous, and maybe they didn't notice them." "You're right," Gemma agreed. "When they're drilling, they need 100% concentration. The chalk and the clay strata that they're boring through are very undulating and uneven, and they constantly need to make sure that the TBM doesn't veer off course, not even by a few centimetres. Besides, I can't see them having the time to carry off 2 coffins. Or, like you say, Detective Pardoe, the motive." "You're talking about the children, aren't you?" Jerry asked Jamila. "You're suggesting it was the children who came and carried them away." "Well, who else? Who else would have wanted a coffin filled with a witch's smoke?" "We're all ready," said Gemma. "I suggest we make a start at the Deptford sewer and see where we go from there. I've arranged for a team to follow us on the surface with ground-penetrating radar, so that even if the coffin's submerged in sewage or buried in saponified fat, we'll be able to locate it." Jerry said, "Good thinking, but there's something else we need to take with us, and that's Blizzard. If that witch woman's anywhere down in the sewers, Blizzard should be able to find her for us. Apart from which, he's about the only thing we know for sure that she's afraid of." He looked across at the Reverend O'Sullivan. "How about you, Reverend? Are you coming with us?" "Oh, my God," said the Reverend O'Sullivan, and crossed himself. They gathered on the corner of Oxtall's Road and Evelyn Street, the long straight road that runs from Deptford past the Surrey Quays. 3 more flushes had already lifted the manhole cover and fenced it off with barriers, and 2 vans from Crane's Drains were parked in the bus lane. It had started to rain quite heavily. The forecast was that it would continue to rain for the rest of the day, and so the flushes were fixing up a blue PVC-coated tent. "Don't want you getting wet, do we?" said one of the flushers, with the soggy roll-up cigarette waggling between his lips. "We're going down a sewer, mate," said Jerry. "We're going to get wet anyway." "Ah, but you ain't been down a sewer when it's flooded in a rainstorm. That is your definitive definition of getting wet." While Jamila and Jerry and the Reverend O'Sullivan were pulling on their waterproof suits and gloves and fitting on their plastic face masks, one of the radar team opened up the tent flap. He was an earnest-looking young man in a fluorescent yellow jerkin with oversized spectacles and a tiny brown moustache. Gemma said, "You look as if you found something." "You said you were looking for 2 coffins, didn't you? We've located a metallic object in the sewer about 800 metres north of here, under Chiltern Grove. It's rectangular, about 2.5 metres in length and 1 metre wide. I'll have a printout for you in a minute." "Only one?" "We're still scanning. We've come across a doll's pram too, although how that got down into the sewer God only knows." "I'm sure he does," said the Reverend O'Sullivan, "but I doubt if he will trouble to tell us." Almost as soon as the radar surveyor had left, the tent flap opened again, and P.C. Maitland appeared. "Got here as soon as I could. Blizzard had to finish his lunch. I normally take him for a walk after he's eaten, but since we're going down a sewer—" One of the flushers handed P.C. Maitland a waterproof suit and a splash-proof face mask. "What about Blizzard?" asked Jerry, as P.C. Maitland zipped himself up. "Blizzard's got his own waterproof suit, with legs. He hates wearing it, but that may be a bonus if we come across that smoke thing again, because it makes him twice as aggressive. I've brought that towel with me, the one from the hospital with the smoke smudge on it, and I'll give him another sniff of it before we go down the sewer. I'll go and fetch him. He's in the back of the van, sulking." He returned after a few minutes, with Blizzard on a short lead. Blizzard was wearing a black vinyl one-piece dog coat, with only his head and his tail showing. His tongue was lolling to one side, and his eyes were bulging, and he looked as if he fiercely resented being dressed to look foolish. When everybody was ready, they climbed down the manhole into the sewer. In the bright swivelling beams from the LED lamps, Jerry could see that it was about the same diameter as the sewer that ran underneath Southampton Way. But the sewage was only ankle deep, because no fatberg was blocking it, and it was able to flow more freely. When he inhaled for the first time, though, he found that the smell was equally pungent. He looked around at Jamila and wrinkled up his nose, but she ignored him. For her, this hunt for the spirit of Adeliza friendship was too frightening and too serious to be making jokes. She was looking for a woman possessed by the devil from another culture and another religion than her own, and that made her feel strangely defenceless, as if none of her prayers could protect her. P.C. Maitland splashed along the sewer first, with Blizzard straining at his lead, and Jerry and Jamila followed closely behind him. Behind Jamila came Gemma, since she was familiar with the layout of the sewers, and would immediately recognise if something was wrong, such as the sewage starting to back up, or if there was any sign that the brick walls were in danger of caving in. After Gemma came Jim Feather, and then the Reverend O'Sullivan, with 2 burly flushers bringing up the rear. One of them was Nigerian and a Catholic, and he kept his hand resting on the Reverend O'Sullivan's right shoulder to make sure that he didn't slip, and to reassure him that he was being looked after. It took them nearly a quarter of an hour to wade their way as far as the junction with Chiltern Grove. As they came nearer, Blizzard began to grow more and more excited, and to yap and splash and tug at his lead. "He's picked up a scent," said P.C. Maitland over his shoulder. "Really?" said Jerry. "He's not the only one." It was then that Jamila said, "Yes," and "yes" on her RT, and tapped Jerry on the back. "The GPR team think they found the other coffin. It's up at the end of Chiltern Grove. It looks as if it's badly damaged, but they're fairly sure that it's a coffin." "Looks like we're in luck then, if you can call it luck. You know, finding 2 coffins down a sewer." They reached the corner of Chiltern Grove, and there it was, lying at an angle against the right-hand wall. Blizzard was dancing in the sewage with excitement, and P.C. Maitland had to snap at him to calm him down. Even then, he stood quivering and sniffing and trampling his paws up and down. "It's her coffin, isn't it?" said Jerry. He approached it cautiously and reached out his hand, but something told him not to touch it, even with his thick, protective gloves. The coffin was made of dark grey metal, with greenish corrosion, probably bronze. It was completely rectangular, like a box, not coffin-shaped, and all around its lid, dozens of open padlocks were dangling like earrings. Blizzard could hardly contain himself, and urinated into the sewage. At the same time, the Reverend O'Sullivan came forward, holding up a large silver crucifix. Behind his protective mask, his face was ashen. "It's heating up," he said. "I've read of this before, but never witnessed it myself. It's so hot that I don't know if I can hold on to it much longer." Blizzard barked and barked again, and kept trying to jump up onto the coffin, his claws scrabbling against its sides. "She's in there," said P.C. Maitland in a haunted voice. "She's only effing in there." Chapter 39. "Dear God!" the Reverend O'Sullivan shouted out. The silver crucifix was melting. The arms of the cross were drooping down over his fingers, and the head of Jesus had liquefied into a shining, featureless blob, which clung to his glove for a moment and then dripped down into the sewage below. All their LED lamps abruptly went out, followed by the lamps on their helmets, and they were plunged into absolute darkness. "Don't panic," said Jim Feather. "Try your emergency lamps, and if they don't work, make an orderly exit back the way we came." A few seconds of rustling and splashing followed, and then Gemma said, "Mine's dead, Jim. Let's get out of here." Jerry reached into the blackness and found Jamila's arm, and then her hand. "Come on, Sarge. This is one of those times when running like fuck is the better part of valor." Gemma had already turned around, and he could feel that she was pushing up against Jim Feather. Before any of them could wade more than 2 or 3 meters, though, there was a deafening bang and a crackle like fireworks, and the sewer ahead of them was filled to the roof with raging green flames. Jerry felt the same ferocious heat that he had felt when the children's ward had been set on fire, and he had to turn his face to one side, even though he was wearing a protective plastic mask. "We'll have to go the other way," shouted Gemma. "There's another manhole further up, at Plough Way." Blizzard was still jumping up at the side of the coffin, but P.C. Maitland dragged him off and started to splash northward. Jerry turned to make sure that none of their party had been injured, and then he and Jamila followed P.C. Maitland. All around them, the green flames threw frantic patterns on the walls of the sewer, They looked like dancing demons, and the dazzling reflections around their boots made it appear as if the sewage itself was on fire. They had waded fewer than 15 metres when the sewer ahead of them exploded with another bang and was blocked with more roaring green fire. "Holy St. Patrick," said the Reverend O'Sullivan, crossing himself twice. "She's trapped us, the witch." Jerry stopped and looked back. When he breathed in, he could feel that the fire was rapidly consuming all the oxygen in the sewer, and the air was becoming hotter and hotter with every second. He could also see that the fires were creeping closer and closer together, and that it would not be long before all 7 of them were incinerated, like the children in Peaceful Ward. "Jerry, what can we do?" said Jamila, gripping his hand even tighter. "We're not going to die, are we?" For a split second, Jerry thought that they could save themselves by lying down under the sewage, but then they wouldn't be able to hold their breath for more than a few seconds, and there was no way of knowing if the fires wouldn't carry on burning, even if they were submerged. Besides, if he was going to die, he would rather be cremated alive than drowned in human waste. But then he thought of the way in which Adeliza Friendship had immolated those 22 children. She had done it immediately, whoomph, without giving them even the slightest chance to escape. So, even though these 2 walls of green fire were gradually edging nearer, why hadn't she killed them all instantly? He looked down and saw that Blizzard was gasping for air, but was still desperately tugging at his lead to get at the coffin. "That's it," he thought. "It's Blizzard. He's a dog, and she's afraid of dogs. Maybe she daren't touch them. Not directly, anyway. Maybe she can allow him to suffocate, but she can't kill him herself." He let go of Jamila's hand and went over to P.C. Maitland. "Give me Blizzard." "What? Why? He won't go with you." "Tell him he has to. Come on, mate. This is our only chance. You want to be barbecued to death, or what?" P.C. Maitland bent down to Blizzard and said, "Go with D.C. Pardoe. Now." He handed Blizzard's lead to Jerry, and Jerry let Blizzard drag him toward the coffin. He had little choice. He hadn't realised how strong Blizzard was, and he was almost pulled clear off his feet. The fires on each side of them were burning even closer now. Gemma had dropped to her knees, and Jim Feather was standing over her, trying to shield her from the heat. The Reverend O'Sullivan was standing with his eyes closed, and his head bowed, and his hands together, praying. The 2 flushers were holding on to each other like long-lost brothers. Jerry went up to the coffin, and Blizzard jumped up against it. "Down," Jerry told him. And from behind him, P.C. Maitland shouted out, "Down, Blizzard! Sit! Do as you're told!" Blizzard sat down, although he was still twitchy. He kept snuffling and licking his lips and making mewling sounds in the back of his throat. Jerry hooked his fingers into 4 of the rings on the side of the coffin, 2 in each hand. He took in a deep breath of hot air, coughed, and then prized the lid up. It was much heavier than he had thought it would be, and for a few seconds he thought he would have to let it drop back down again. But then he gritted his teeth and gave it another heave, and it fell off the coffin and clattered down against the side of the sewer. There was a shrieking howl, and out of the coffin boiled the smoky figure of Adeliza Friendship, her hood stretched up into a high point, and her sleeves flapping wide. Jerry staggered back and nearly lost his balance. He looked up into Adeliza Friendship's hood and saw her face, her eyes incandescent white, her mouth stretched wide open, her teeth bared. Satan's mistress in a satanic fury. "Kill, Blizzard!" Jerry shouted at him, almost screaming, and let go of his lead. "Kill!" Blizzard leaped up at Adeliza Friendship, but his jaws met nothing but smoke, and he dropped back down again. All the same, he leaped up a second time, snarling at her. Adeliza Friendship whirled around and around like a dust devil. She flowed out of the coffin and up to the roof of the sewer, opening her sleeves out wide. The Reverend O'Sullivan stood beneath her, looking up at her and making the sign of the cross. "I command thee, demon, to be gone. I command thee to leave this world and return to the depths of hell in which you were spawned. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, I dismiss thee. I dismiss thee. I dismiss thee." Adeliza Friendship's smoky figure remained spread-eagled against the bricks. The green fires were still blazing on either side, and Jerry thought that she was showing her contempt for the Reverend O'Sullivan by refusing to leave. But then Blizzard leaped up again and started to bark, and she twisted around, turned to the north side of the sewer, and disappeared into the flames. At once, the flames sank down, and then flickered, and then died out altogether. The 7 of them were left staring at each other in disbelief. Jerry looked down into the coffin. The bottom of it was covered by a fine layer of grey ash, and lying on top of the ash was a handsaw, its serrated blade still stained with amber spots of dried blood. He beckoned to Jamila. "There's our murder weapon, unless I'm greatly mistaken." "So how do we explain to the coroner that a woman made of nothing but smoke could carry a saw?" "We lie," said Jerry. "It won't be the first time." A fresh draught blew down the tunnel, and it smelled strongly of sewage, but at least it was breathable. "Holy shit," said P.C. Maitland. The Reverend O'Sullivan crossed himself again. "I'm afraid to say that sums it up to a T." 11 days later, Louise woke up and saw that the sun was shining. She sat up in bed and realised that she wasn't in her room at the Whittington Rest Home, but in a hospital ward, surrounded by screens. She felt swimmy and bruised between her legs, as if somebody had been repeatedly kicking her. Then she remembered. The sudden cramps, and then the contractions. Her fellow carer, Linda Pearson, driving her to the Birthwell Centre. After that, though, she couldn't remember anything. She reached across and pressed the call button. After only a few moments, the screens parted and a smiling nurse appeared. "You're awake? How are you feeling?" "Terrible. Confused." "Well, we had to give you a general anaesthetic." "Have I had them?" The nurse had an oddly doll-like face, with bright red lipstick, and kept on smiling. "Yes, you've had them." What are they like?" "Like all babies. What were you expecting?" The scans showed that they weren't normal." "Oh, it depends on what you mean by normal, doesn't it?" "Where are they?" "I don't want to see them, but where are they? What's going to happen to them?" "They've gone." "Gone? Gone where?" The nurse sat down on the bed and took hold of Louise's hand. "I took them," she said, and her voice was suddenly hoarse, like a woman who's been smoking all her life. "You took them? I don't understand." "They're my nestlings. Don't worry. I'll take good care of them. They're sacred. All children are sacred. Even the children God forgot." You've been listening to The Children God Forgot by Graham Masterton, narrated by Caroline Lennon. Published by W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted 2021 Graham Masterton. This recording is copyrighted 2021 Head of Zeus.